My name is Tess Wilson. I'm the Network Engagement Manager for Audubon Mid-Atlantic. I am so excited to have everyone here tonight. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm going to do a short introduction, and then we can get started. So tonight we have three really great speakers. I'm really excited to, I'm just admitting people here, sorry. I'm really excited to have everyone hear what these folks have to say. And so I'm not going to take too much time. I'll just do short introductions and then I'm going to pass it off to Ezra. Ezra Thrush is going to be our first speaker tonight. Based in Penn Future's Harrisburg office, Ezra Thrush leads and develops the organization's policy initiatives and is its liaison with elected officials in both Harrisburg and Washington, D.C. And in this, in this role, Ezra manages all legislative and executive branch relationships, as well as public policy decisions and processes for Penn Future. As a member of the senior leadership team, Thrush serves as Penn Future's chief lobbyist and external voice on policy positions, strategy, and relationships with decision makers at the local, state, and federal levels of government. Ezra also represents Penn Future on the steering committee of the Choose Clean Water Coalition. Ezra has worked extensively on state and federal issues, including stormwater management, clean water funding, agriculture, forest retention, the Farm Bill, climate change, and water infrastructure, among others. Ezra holds a master's degree in public administration with concentrations in public policy and nonprofit management, in addition to bachelor degrees in history and political science from Shippensburg University. Next up is Flora Cardoni. Flora is Penn Environment's field director and climate campaign director. And in that role, she oversees much of Penn Environment's climate and grassroots organizing work, directing staff and mobilizing volunteers around the state to fight climate change and promote good, clean energy policy at the local, state, and federal level. And before taking on this role, Flora was a member of Green Corps, where she led campaigns to register youth to vote in Arizona and oppose the Dakota Access Pipeline in Iowa. She's also directed several door-to-door canvass offices around the state on behalf of Penn Environment and Work for Progress. And finally, Jim Brown. Jim Brown has 20 years of experience working with communities and their natural places. Prior to Audubon, Jim was director of Trail Nation projects at Rails to Trails Conservancy, assisting communities in building trail networks in cities and towns across the U.S. through design, advocacy, policy, fundraising, and coalition building. Jim's work at Rails to Trails was often featured at national and regional conferences focused on transportation, trail design, equity, and community development. Other experiences include work with the Baltimore City Department of Recreation and Parks and working as an environmental educator. Jim also served as a U.S. Peace Corps volunteer in Tanzania, working on environmental and agroecology projects. And he has a master's degree in landscaping architecture from Morgan State University and a bachelor's degree in anthropology from the University of New Hampshire. At Audubon Mid-Atlantic, Jim enjoys working with chapters, staff, partners, and elected officials to create climate and bird-friendly policies that connect the dots between birds, climate change, community access to nature, and bird-friendly communities. So I'm really excited to have these folks speak today. I'm going to stop sharing. If it's okay with everyone, I'd like to hold questions until the end, but there will be plenty of time for questions at the end. And I'm going to keep an eye on the chat too and keep any that we don't get to. With that, I'm going to hand it over to Ezra.
Hey, thanks so much, Tess, and thanks everybody for joining us here tonight. I really appreciate being here with Audubon and Mid-Atlantic chapters. So I work in Harrisburg and in Washington, primarily state-based organization doing state-based policy advocacy, but I'm one of the main lobbyists for the environmental and conservation community in Pennsylvania, meeting with legislators day in and day out, meeting with Governor Shapiro and his executive staff in his office, meeting with Secretaries Nick Green, Cindy Adams-Dunn, and Russell Redding, who are in charge of Department of Environmental Protection, Department of Conservation and Natural Resources, and Department of Agriculture. And they all have a key role to play in moving a good policy forward for environment and climate and conservation in Pennsylvania. I just wanted to start off and lay the land of what does it look like for policy in Pennsylvania right now? What is the lay of the land of the legislature? What's happening currently with Governor Shapiro and his brand new acting secretaries? And what's the vision for the administration? And I want to talk about what are some policy priorities that PennFuture and a bunch of our partners, including Audubon Mid-Atlantic and other folks in our coalitions, are working on this year and during this 2-year term. As you might know, we just began the next 2-year legislative term in Harrisburg for this General Assembly. In Harrisburg, we operate on 2-year legislative terms. It kicked off on January 3rd. It was the first Tuesday in January. And so what happens is everybody comes to Harrisburg, and they, if they were reelected or elected in November, they get sworn into office. And then what happens is, after they get sworn into office, they hold a vote for speaker, and they try to pass a rules package. If you're following along in the news the last couple months in Harrisburg, you might notice that the margin for majority in Harrisburg has been so razor thin and narrow that although Democrats had won through election 102 seats, we had 3 different folks who had to vacate their seats at the end of last year. Tony DeLuca, who was a state representative from Northern Allegheny County, had passed away, unfortunately, before Election Day came. So his seat was vacant. Summer Lee, who was also from the Pittsburgh area, ran for 2 offices, and she won the office of member of Congress there in the 12th district in Pittsburgh, and now she's in Washington, D.C., serving Pennsylvanians in Congress. And of course, also in Allegheny County, Austin Davis from the 35th district in McKeesport area became our next lieutenant governor. So we had these 3 different vacancies that had to be filled, and it took a little bit until we got back to a place where there was a clear majority in Harrisburg. So at one point in time, although Democrats had won 102 seats, Republicans had a narrow majority of 1 seat. And Republicans were really pushing back and trying to hold on to their majority as long as they could. So there was no clear vote for a speaker for many hours on January 3rd in Harrisburg. And until there was a speaker vote, similar to the fight that happened in Washington, D.C. in January, until there was a speaker vote, there couldn't be any rules package accepted. Late in the day on January 3rd, there became a compromise speaker between Democrats and Republican leadership with Speaker Mark Rozzi. Mark Rozzi was a state representative, still is a state representative from West Reading in Berks County. And he had an overall lifetime conservation voter score of 86%. So it's pretty good. He's not a 100% environmental champion, but pretty good being from an industrial part of Berks County. And he's been in the legislature for just over 10 years now. His key priorities are trying to move statute of limitations legislation through constitutional amendment to put in place remove statute of limitations for child sex abuse, and that's been a longtime priority of his. So, with his newly won speakership, he was going to move that issue first and move that a constitutional amendment. Unfortunately, the House has not been organized since that speaker election. There has not been a clear enough majority for one side or the other, either political party, to get a rules package passed. And because we hadn't had a rules package passed in January, we've been going a month and a half without any kind of legislative session in Harrisburg. The House of Representatives have not been able to meet. And Republicans and Democrats have been going back and forth on what to agree upon on rules. And Republicans had put out their names for Republican chairs of committees. Democrats had not yet announced their Democratic chairs or committee assignments, though I'm hearing we should be getting committee chairs and committee assignments next week. This week, the House of Representatives is back in Harrisburg, and the House of Representatives is meeting in special session to try to move these special statute of limitations on child sex abuse legislation, constitutional amendments, and to try to move some kind of rules package for regular session. The hope is that next week, when the House of Representatives returns to Harrisburg for regular legislative session, they can begin the work of the people, pass an agreed upon rules package that Democrats have agreed to. They now have 102 members outright with a one person majority. There are 203 members of the Pennsylvania House of Representatives, so it's only a 1-seat majority now. They're planning to move those and to announce committee business and chairs and start the work of this General Assembly finally. On the other hand, the Senate had met the first week of January, and the Senate has organized its committees, its leadership, and there are all kinds of committee assignments. The Senate is controlled by Republicans right now. We have Senator Kim Ward from Westmoreland County, who is the president pro tempore. She's the first woman to hold this role in the Senate. And they've already organized their committees and started holding committee meetings and even moving bills on the floor and holding final floor votes. Just an interesting thing is that the Senate had passed a package of constitutional amendments. Something that folks had been trying to move in Harrisburg for quite some time is constitutional amendments on a number of issues, including regulatory rollback, regulatory reform is what Republicans in Harrisburg call it. Unfortunately, some of those issues provide some pretty negative implications for environmental policy and environmental protections in Pennsylvania. So Penn Future and a lot of our allies were fighting back against some of the constitutional amendment language that the Senate was trying to move because it would hurt some of our important environmental protections. The Senate moved that over to the House, and that bill has just been sitting in the House since they moved it about a month and a half ago because we haven't organized. When those seats were vacated by those 3 members of the House, there was another member that vacated her seat in Sunbury in Northumberland County because she ran and won a special election to become a new state senator because the state senator had left to become a lawyer for Senator Pro Tem Kim Ward. So there were special elections held on January 31st, and special elections were held on February 7th. And we officially have a full complement in the House now. And next week, when the Senate comes back to Harrisburg, the Senate will have its full complement. So we're going to have about 3 weeks of legislative session starting next week. They'll be in the week of the 27th, the week of March 6th, and they'll be in the week of March 13th for legislative session, regular legislative session. They'll start to do committee work and moving bills between the 2 chambers. What we're hearing right now is that starting the week of March 8th, we are going to begin budget hearings. Every year at this time of year, we have budget hearings that the House and Senate Appropriations Committees will meet and hold, and they'll consider the governor's proposed budget. Governor Shapiro is scheduled to deliver his State of the Commonwealth address to the Joint General Assembly and to propose his budget, state budget for fiscal year 24 on March 7th. So that's coming up in a few weeks. He's going to do that in Harrisburg, and that'll kick off all of these budget hearings. Agency secretaries and their staff, executive staff, will be interviewed essentially by members of the House and Senate Appropriations Committees for the rest of the month of March and the first part of April. And after that, the rest of the spring, April, May, and June, you'll see a lot of budget advocacy in Harrisburg. Penn Future and our friends in the environmental conservation community will be pushing for increases specifically for the DEP and DCNR and Department of Agriculture for more conservation dollars, more staffing at the agencies, and more money for projects to go out the door and do the good work of conservation. So we're eager to push for those issues. In particular, I wanted to mention some of the budget priorities that we have. A lot of us have been working on these for quite some time in the realm of water policy. Last year we had some pretty successful big wins that came from investments from the American Rescue Plan in our state budget. That happened in the first week of July. We now have something called the Municipal Stormwater Assistance Program that's funded at a few $100 million. to help municipalities do stormwater management projects and to do things around resiliency, to do flood water management. And so there's just really been a big need for municipalities to get some more help to do stormwater projects. We also created a new program called the Agriculture Conservation Assistance Program. That's now a full program and funded through ARPA monies to help get money out the door through the State Conservation Commission and the county conservation districts to give money to farmers and landowners to do buffers and other kinds of best management practices to keep our streams, creeks, and rivers clean, especially from agriculture runoff. So we're really excited about that. And then we just got significant historic increases at the agencies last year. The story is not done with that yet, though. All of that money is from the American Rescue Plan. It'll run out eventually. And you might know Pennsylvania has a pretty big water pollution problem. About 34% of our waterways are impaired in Pennsylvania. So we have to try to find some kind of permanent funding source. We need recurring revenue, not just a one-time shot from the federal government for our clean water projects and conservation in Pennsylvania. So we're working now with a bunch of Republican senators and members of the Democratic delegation in the House, Governor Shapiro and his folks, and the agency secretaries to try to find a way to get more funding and permanent funding with a recurring revenue source. If you've been following Harrisburg for quite some time, you might know that that's pretty challenging. It's long been an elusive thing, is to find some kind of funding mechanism that is permanent and will give us money every single year. So that's something we're working on. We also believe it's really important to make sure our river basin commissions in Pennsylvania get their full share funding. In last year's state budget, we were able to get full share funding for the Susquehanna River Basin Commission. When we got increased funding, but we're not at full share capacity yet for the Great Lakes Commission, for the Interstate Commission for the Potomac River Basin, and for the Ohio River Sanitary Commission, or SANCO. But really, they're not at the same levels as Susquehanna yet. We need to be pushing for more funding for those basin commissions. And of course, we have the Delaware River Basin Commission. Unfortunately, a lot of folks in Harrisburg still are trying to tie, something that the DRBC had done a couple years ago to ban hydraulic fracturing in the Delaware Basin to not wanting to give them any more funding. But we continue to make the push that Delaware River Basin Commission needs to get its full share funding as well. They do a lot of really critical work in water quality and water quantity, and they're really important for our ecosystems and our conservation in the state as well. So we'll continue to push for every single river basin commission in Pennsylvania to get their full share funding from Pennsylvania. And I just heard this year that there's new legislation that passed at the end of last year that says the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, who is supposed to pay the federal government share of their funding, that they're planning to do so this year. Moving forward, the federal government is going to do so. So we're really excited about that. I had mentioned the agencies, the importance of the agencies. Department of Environmental Protection and DCNR are pretty underfunded and understaffed. DEP is probably, the biggest concern along those lines. We're going to be continuing to push for more staffing and more resources, particularly at the Department of Environmental Protection. So that's something we'll be asking for in our advocacy for the budget this spring. We also do a lot of work around clean energy and climate, and I know that we share some priorities with Audubon and a lot of partners in the conservation community. We had passed a carbon trading program rule through the regulatory process about a year ago. It's called, it links us to the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. It's a carbon pollution cutting mechanism. I'm sure you've heard of it, but if you haven't, happy to chat more about that. But the plan is to continue to protect that rulemaking in Pennsylvania and try to keep it safe. And eventually, Pennsylvania, after some court decisions, likely this spring or this summer, Pennsylvania will be able to participate in auctions with other states who participate in the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. And then after the auction, there will be proceeds. After the trade-in credits, there will be proceeds that will come back to the state. And Pennsylvania, we're hoping, will reinvest those proceeds back into environmental justice communities, carbon pollution remediation, and trying to work on cutting working on our air quality issues. And we also want to reinvest a large number of those proceeds into workforce development and working with labor communities in Pennsylvania. So that's something we'll be working on through the energy space. You might also be familiar with something called the Alternative Energy Portfolio Standards. A lot of states in the country call it renewable portfolio standards. Pennsylvania, of course, has to be special. We're going to try to push for expanding the Alternative Energy Portfolio Standards, which is basically a law that says Pennsylvania needs to get a mix of its energy sources from renewables, from unfortunately, we have a carve out for waste coal and biomass and low impact hydro, and right now Pennsylvania, lion's share of our energy comes from coal and from oil and gas, to a lesser extent nuclear. But this legislation, we're hoping to expand the solar targets and the wind targets. We would like to get 30% of Pennsylvania's energy from renewables by 2030. So that's our hope, working with Governor Shapiro's administration and the General Assembly. We're going to be working on building out our energy efficiency projects across the state, working with a lot of business partners and folks, corporations and companies that do energy efficiency. We're also going to be working on updated Pennsylvania's building codes this year. It might not be this year, but it might be 2024. But during this 2-year term, we're going to continue to advocate for spending the IRA and IIJA dollars well. I know that Flora is going to talk about that a little bit more, so I won't say anything additionally on that. But we want to make sure it's spent well and spent wisely. We're going to try to continue to push, and I'm hopeful that we'll get it done this legislative session, something called community solar, and a lot of organizations in the energy, environment, conservation community are really hopeful to try to push community solar. What it basically does is it removes technical barriers and legal barriers and allows for more Pennsylvanians to participate in solar. You know, if you don't have $30,000-$40,000 for your own solar array, or you don't own your own home, we have a lot of folks who live in apartments in Pennsylvania. This will allow folks to put solar panels on roofs, have these creation of community solar gardens in a community, and a lot of folks then can tap into it, pitch into it. At the end of the month, they can get credits off their energy bills. So it would just incentivize more solar photovoltaic power generation in the state, which is something we're trying to push for, more renewables that'll work on our climate goals. And of course, we want to continue working on building out our electric vehicle infrastructure in the state. A lot of folks don't know this, but about 33% of our carbon pollution in Pennsylvania comes from the transportation sector. So we're working with groups like PICO and auto manufacturers and other environmental conservation groups to try to push forward legislation that will build out our EV charging stations. And so we're going to continue to work on that effort. And folks might know this. We have a big transportation act, Act 89. It gets renewed every several years and reauthorized with new money. That fight's going to come up probably this year or next year in the General Assembly. As a part of the transportation policy, we don't do a whole lot of work in that realm, but as transportation issues become top of mind in the General Assembly over the next year or two, we're going to try to push for conservation priorities and any place that it makes sense for climate provisions or pushing for public transit or clean energy in the area of transportation. We're going to be advocating for clean air and for climate friendly provisions. So I will stop there. I just got a warning, but I'll stop there and look forward to questions later. And I'll turn it back over to Tess. Thanks so much, Tess. Thanks so much, everybody.
Thank you so much. As always, full of so much helpful information. Thank you so much. I'm going to put, Ezra, your email in the chat. And if anyone has questions, I'll put Ezra's email in the chat, as well as a couple other helpful links. And I'll pass it over to Flora, who's going to talk to us about the IRA and incentives involved in that. Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you so much, Tess. And hello, everyone. My name is Flora Cardoni, and as you heard, I'm the field director with Penn Environment. I know I've worked with a lot of you before, but for those of you who may not know, Penn Environment is a statewide, people-powered environmental advocacy nonprofit. And together with thousands of members, activists, volunteers from all around Pennsylvania, we work to make sure everyone has clean air to breathe, clean water to drink, protected public lands to enjoy, and a safe and livable climate to call home. And we made a lot of progress towards that vision of a safe and livable climate in the last year. First, the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act included major investments to improve transportation and power infrastructure across the United States, with funding to support the expansion of things like electric vehicle charging network here in Pennsylvania and around the country, record investments in public transit and rail and walking and biking infrastructure, that multimodal transit that's so important to decrease carbon emissions, increase funding for electric school and transit buses, funding to strengthen the electric grid and improve energy efficiency, and more. And then last summer, the Inflation Reduction Act, or IRA, was signed into law. And as many of you know, that was the largest investment in climate action and clean energy that has ever been passed in US history. Specifically, it included $370 billion in tax credits and other programs to expand clean energy, improve energy efficiency, reduce air pollution, and slash planet warming greenhouse gas emissions. And those incentives in that bill will make it easier and more affordable for Pennsylvanians, for Americans, to put solar on their roofs, to buy an electric vehicle or heat pump, to make their home more energy efficient, and more, which of course is good for our wallets, with folks saving money on our energy bills. But more importantly, it's good for our planet. But in order to actually see the improvements to energy efficiency, the growth of clean energy, the lowering of climate pollution that's touted in these bills, we need to make sure that people are actually taking advantage of these programs. And unfortunately, most Americans don't have any idea what the Inflation Reduction Act is, what it does. And even those of us who have been following closely don't necessarily know how to take advantage of all of those incentives. Part of the reason for that is that some of this information is continuing to come out throughout this year. So certainly as more updates are available, we'll be spreading the word. But there's a few things I want to talk about right now. So of course, a top priority at Penn Environment, a lot of groups across the state and country this year will be doing that, making sure people know what these incentives are and how that they can take advantage. And so I hope you all can help us do that as well. Talk to your own friends and family and neighbors and colleagues around the country so they can take advantage. And to get us started, I wanted to share a couple resources that I'll put in the chat. So the first is a helpful explainer from energy.gov. This is the best resource that I've seen so far on what's actually included in the Inflation Reduction Act. It gives an overview of these programs, specifies what types of appliances or energy efficiency upgrades are included. These include things like solar panels for your home or battery storage systems, electric and geothermal heat pumps, and even home insulation materials, which is something I wasn't sure was included. Sorry about that. My cat wanted to say hi, I guess. So I definitely recommend checking that out. Most of these incentives are tax credits that are available for tax years 2023 to 2032. So certainly we have time to take advantage of this stuff. And you can access those credits via the IRS Form 5695. There's more information about that on this resource, again, from energy.gov. Definitely encourage you to go there to see what's available. There's frequently asked questions and describes how to take advantage of some of those credits. I also wanted to share some resources from our partners at Environment America, which is our national affiliate group. We have a clean energy toolkits and guides and past webinars all about the incentives in the IRA, how to electrify your home or vehicle, how to make your home more energy efficient, the difference between an induction stove and a gas stove and what the benefits are and how to take advantage. And of course, has resources about why this stuff is so important for our environment and climate. So you can certainly check out that explainer for how to electrify your home with tax credits. and this Clean Energy Toolkit, which has a lot more information about, the different programs that are available and how you can take advantage. In addition to, and then as I mentioned, more information will become available throughout this year from the White House and from state officials. So in addition to taking advantage of these credits yourselves and ideally helping your friends and family and neighbors know about this stuff too, it's also going to be really critical that we're making sure our elected officials at every level are helping to share this information out to their constituents that might not be as plugged in, posting on social media, sharing things to their lists, doing telephone town halls. We'll do some of those events, but certainly if you work with any elected officials yourselves in any of your groups, this is a great thing to bring up with them, asking them to share this information out so that more people can take advantage. And of course, it's not just individuals. These credits are newly available for nonprofits, for places of worship like churches and synagogues, which previously these programs weren't available for those types of entities. There's programs for businesses. So certainly it's not just homeowners. There's a lot that we can do here to, put solar on our church or our nonprofit as well, or to electrify fleets. And then it's also not just, these energy efficiency or clean energy upgrades. We also need to make sure that our school districts and local governments know how that they can take advantage of new programs. There's funding in both of these, the infrastructure bill to electrify school bus fleets, to expand electric vehicle charging networks, to expand public transit, as I mentioned, also things outside of the climate realm, replacing lead pipes and service lines and more. So we need to make sure that when, for example, grant periods are open for applying for an electric school bus or electric vehicle charging stations, our school districts and local governments are taking advantage of that. Again, we'll certainly be flagging that for folks, but great to keep in mind for anyone you work with. And finally, as Ezra mentioned, we need to be making sure state legislators and agencies are spending their infrastructure dollars wisely as they build out this electric vehicle charging network with PennDOT, or as we're, electrifying and expanding public transit. So certainly it'll be a conversation we're having in Harrisburg, making sure that the DEP and other agencies are keeping these things in mind, talking to local and state officials. And you can help us do all that, but the best thing that you can all do is start taking advantage of these incentives yourself and sharing it with your friends and family. And this is essential because the Inflation Reduction Act is poised to cut climate pollution up to 42% by 2030. This is the biggest, reduction in climate pollution we've ever seen. We need to cut climate pollution in half by 2030 to stop the worst impacts of climate change, and this gets us a long way there. This has the potential to spur energy efficiency and clean energy in ways we've never seen before and make clean energy more accessible, more widespread, more affordable. But the only way that that's all possible, the only way we'll see these reductions in climate pollutions that we need to see to stop the worst impacts of climate change is if people actually take advantage of these programs. So public education is key, and I hope that you can all help us do that this year. And with that, I will hand it back over to Tess.
Thank you so much. That was great. And thanks for those links too. That's super helpful. Yeah, that was full of great information. I'll do a quick plug too. The Coalition for the Delaware River Watershed is also putting on a webinar with more information about the IRA. So if you're still curious, stick around and ask questions tonight, but I'll also put a link to that event in the chat as well. And with that, I'll hand it over to Jim Brown. Thank you so much, Flora.
Hey, hello, everybody. It's good to be here tonight. I'm pulling up some slides. Bear with me. Okay. And now I cannot. Okay. Thank you. Okay, got it. Can everyone see the screen? Excellent. Thanks. Well, thank you so much, Tess, for running the show tonight, and for Ezra and Flora for sharing your expertise with us today. I'm going to spend a few minutes just going over what the Pennsylvania priorities and opportunities as we see them are for both birds and environmental policy will be in Pennsylvania in this upcoming session. So I'm glad to do that and happy that you're all here. I'll try to leave plenty of time for questions at the end. But the main the main points of how our policy platform is being developed is built off of the Audubon Mid-Atlantic strategic plan, which is in the final stages. It's at the copy editors now and the graphic designers, and it's in the final stages of getting finalized, and it'll be made public very shortly. We'll send it to everybody, and it'll be available on our website. But the habitat protections and environmental protections that come out of that really have these 5 buckets that are informing what our policy platform will be in the broader region, but in particular in Pennsylvania too. And those have a focus on habitat protection for birds, identifying sustained public funding and to support conservation and natural climate solutions, increased access to nature and access to bird-centric programming for people across the region, and particularly in the areas where we work in Pennsylvania. And then, as has been mentioned, accelerating the development of renewable energy across the region. And then finally, but critically important, is engaging our members and chapters and expanding our constituency to be as diverse as the region is itself. And I'm having trouble advancing the slides. There we go. Okay. So the strategic plan I mentioned has 5 pillars that are focused on habitats in the region, and almost all of those habitats take place in Pennsylvania. The Delaware River watershed is a primary source of drinking water for over 16 million Americans, and it's a really important migratory corridor for millions of birds that rely on the riparian buffers and the forests and the ridges and the flyways that make up the Delaware River watershed. So our program work in
what are you doing?
In Philadelphia, in all towns and areas up and down the watershed informs what our policy needs are for the region. And similarly, forests, as we all know, forests are a huge indicator of ecosystem health. We want our policies to protect forest systems, stabilize and reverse forest bird population declines, and preserve the integrity of ecosystem services, while keeping these places open to the public, so that everyone that gets to see them in turn becomes advocates for the environment and advocates for birds as well. And then a third pillar is our urban and suburban work. Audubon Mid-Atlantic has centers in Baltimore and in Philadelphia and in Montgomery County. We also take our work out into the field, into the ecosystems all over Pennsylvania. But we really want to focus on policies that increase access to natural areas for people living in urban areas and suburban areas, and acknowledge that urban and suburban areas are critical habitat too. So they're important places for birds to survive, and the way that humans and birds interact, it happens very significantly in these urban and suburban areas. And then renewable energy has been mentioned a few times on this call, but it really is the most significant threat to birds in our hemisphere. And if we can accelerate the development of renewable energy and make sure that it's properly sited and managed to reduce the risk to migratory and resident birds, it's gonna do the most to protect the planet for both birds and people long into the future. So there's a regional goal to get the Maryland, Pennsylvania, Delaware to having 40% of their total energy usage coming from renewable sources by 2030, and then 100% by 2050. And then our 5th pillar of the plan, which has less to do with Pennsylvania, but I know all of you travel to other places in the region, so is coasts. A lot of our work in Maryland and Delaware has to do with the impacts of climate-induced sea level rise and habitat loss in marshes and nesting islands. So our staff in Maryland is working really hard to develop plans and access funding through policy, administrative actions to protect these nesting islands and marsh throughout the Delaware Bay and the Chesapeake Bay and at the Atlantic coastal bays. And particular birds of significance that we're working to protect are the salt marsh sparrow, the black rail, the royal tern, the black skimmer, and other nesting species that migrate from the southern hemisphere through the East Coast up to the Arctic. And then, so how do we do this? We do this by building coalitions, educating lawmakers. We testify at bill hearings. We write op-eds and letters to the editors. We collaborate with our chapter networks, of which there are 26 in Pennsylvania. In all corners of the state, every region of the state is represented. And we want to work with chapters and other constituents to place letters to the editor in papers, have advocacy days in Harrisburg and DC, do learning tours, submit letters of testimony, and support our policies in action. And then we form partnerships like with Flora and as we're on the call with other groups throughout the state. We build coalitions that advance our environmental priorities throughout the state. And this is a picture of Maryland with our staff giving Governor Hogan a tour of nesting islands. And this year, our goal will be to have a similar picture with Governor Shapiro looking at the critical habitat in Pennsylvania and explaining our work to him. So as Ezra mentioned, there's a lot of changes in the state. We're happy to hear Governor Shapiro is renominating Cindy Dunn to be the DCNR secretary. Rich Negrin with the Department of Environmental Protection has really strong management background, and that's something that the agency really needs. And as Ezra mentioned, there's a Democratic majority in the House as of last week, and a Republican majority in the Senate. So there are some changes and potential opportunities in Pennsylvania this year and in the coming years. So some really some of our priorities that we'll be focusing on in the short term and medium term are identifying sustained sources of funding for growing greener 3 type programs. That was a one-time shot in the arm, and we really need to work with our partners and agencies to have a sustained source of funding to keep those levels of funding elevated to support the work of protecting our landscapes, watersheds, forests throughout the state. And then additionally increase funding for the Department of Environmental Protection, because as others have mentioned so far tonight, a significant amount of streams and waterways in the state are not in good health, and we need to make sure that DEP has adequate funding to enact the Clean Streams Law and the Clean Water Act. And then Ezra touched on some of these, so I won't go too far into them, but really developing a strong alternative energy portfolio standards. We believe that we can get to 30% in Pennsylvania by 2030 and 100% by 2050. And related to that, we really need to keep Pennsylvania in the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, RGGI. We've been hearing that there may be some trade-offs in the House and Senate in Pennsylvania in order to develop a robust alternative energy portfolio standards. Some people may start advocating to get out of RGGI, and we want to prevent that from happening. It's important that both of those things happen at the same time to protect Pennsylvania's environment and bird habitat from the climate impacts of continuing to rely on carbon. And then as we mentioned, the state goals to incentivize accessible solar. So that doesn't just mean utility solar, but also community solar throughout the state. And we're working on a similar bill in Maryland that may be a good option to see if we can replicate in Pennsylvania. And then, as was mentioned, we will work hard to make sure that the state upholds its share of dues to all of the river basins, but a significant focus of our work will be the Delaware River Basin Commission, where we have dedicated staff to working on the Delaware watershed from New York down through Pennsylvania into the Delaware Bay, with a focus on red knots in the Delaware Bay and horseshoe crabs to more riparian buffers and working with the agricultural community in upstate Pennsylvania, New York, and everywhere in between. but all of the waterways are connected, and all of them will deserve their fair share of funding. And additionally, related to water, we would like to work with the new administration on updating some of the water quality standards that are found in certain aspects of code in Pennsylvania law that do not only is clean water important for bird habitat, but it's critical for all of human and all of wildlife too. So increasing these stream protections will be good for everybody. And then there a big focus on natural climate solutions, with both forests, streams, and rivers falling under that. But our forest staff is helping develop ideas and concepts that we can work with agencies and the legislature to really promote healthy forest management throughout the state. Healthy forest, most of the forests in Pennsylvania are privately owned, and we would like to figure out ways to incentivize both state foresters and private landowners to really start taking a look at what healthy forest management is. And it's the a forest that is managed properly will sequester carbon. It will generate revenue by providing superior wood products, and it will be a tourist destination to support ecotourism, all while improving and protecting critical bird habitat. So that'll be a priority for us in the coming years in Pennsylvania. And it has side effects too of increasing water quality and air quality throughout the state and the region as well. And then some discrete or more narrowed in approaches are a wildlife corridors bill that was introduced last year but did not make it out of the session in Harrisburg. We think it has a good shot of coming into fruition this year, and that's establishing a wildlife corridor study by the Department of Transportation, which will identify corridors throughout the state, including flyways that deserve special protection, and then make them eligible for more funding throughout the state budget and from federal sources when they may become available. And then something else that we're exploring along one of our priority habitats in a Pennsylvania conservation landscape is the incentivizing the development of solar on top of all of the new warehouses that are being developed along the Kittatinny Ridge. And there's, the ball has started rolling on those warehouse developments, but are there things that we can do to mitigate their impact to the habitat and to the climate by making them renewable energy generators also along this critical habitat of the ridge? So there's really interesting examples from New Jersey and Massachusetts and other places that have started to require warehouses that are being developed to be able to, when they're being funded, designed, and built, to be able to accommodate solar panels on the roof. So that's also something that we would like to explore and elevate in Pennsylvania. So then I'll close up with just some federal notes on the in Washington, D.C., we're going to, again, focus on mitigating the impacts of climate change. There's some changes in D.C. right now. There's going to be a lot of gridlock this year, but mitigating the impacts of climate change is becoming an increasingly bipartisan issue, and communities across the country are starting to demand it. So we think that there's room to advance these goals in D.C. Securing habitat strongholds, and continuing to secure funding to strengthen the conservation programs that the federal government has now, and bring those funds to the states. So practically, that's transitioning to energy development. A big bill that has a really good chance of passing this year is the Farm Bill, which will double the investments in conservation programs run by the Department of Agriculture. And it will increase opportunities to do a lot of reforestation projects and natural climate solutions in partnership with the agricultural community. And then continuing to increase and invest in natural climate solutions. So real quickly, related to what Flora mentioned, these are some of the programs coming out of the IRA and the bipartisan infrastructure bill that we think could be applied to the region and in particular Pennsylvania. And it's going to take all of us on the call working with our state agencies and our state electeds and federal electeds to make sure that states like Pennsylvania know how to access these funds. But there's over $700 million available for carbon sequestration work on forest lands. There's over $500 million available in grants and loans to be applied for by the states for conservation, habitat restoration, and resiliency projects on National Park Service land, which in Pennsylvania there is some, and 2.6 billion for coastal resilience and restoration protection in marine habitat resources. That may have less to do with Pennsylvania, but similar ecosystems that the rivers in Pennsylvania flow into and the interconnectedness there. And then there's over $3 billion in the infrastructure law that passed before the IRA that will support ecosystems by reopening stream and river passage, restoring marsh habitats, and providing storm buffers from increased flooding. So I'll wrap up there. Thanks for your attention. And just in closing, we can't do this without you. So birds need you to be their advocate, to speak on their behalf in Harrisburg and DC, to build coalitions with your neighbors and your neighboring towns, to tell your neighbors how they can support birds in Pennsylvania. And I think importantly, to have fun doing it. These are big issues, but when you care about something and which you all do because you're here on a Wednesday night, you can enjoy doing it. And it's something that we should be able to enjoy while we're advocating for our environment and our birds and making the most out of it. So thanks so much for your time. I'll pass it back to Tess.